In the autumn of 1964, a 62-year-old man sat alone in the front seat of his car on the side of a highway in Kentucky, holding a Social Security check for $105. In the back seat sat everything he had left in the world: a pressure cooker, a few cans of spices, and a recipe he had spent over 30 years perfecting. He had owned a restaurant once. He had owned a motel. He had built something real, something he was proud of, in a small town where people drove for miles just to eat his food. And then, almost overnight, a new interstate highway was built a few miles away. The traffic that once filled his parking lot disappeared, and the business he had spent his entire adult life building was gone. At 62 years old, with a $105 check in his hand, Harland Sanders had nothing left to lose. And nothing left to lose was about to become the most dangerous thing he had ever been. Think about where you are right now in your life. Think about everything you have built, the years, the sacrifices, the things you told yourself would finally pay off. Now imagine watching all of it disappear, not because you failed, but because the world simply moved on without asking you. That is exactly what happened to Harland Sanders. He was not a young man with his whole life ahead of him. He was 62, an age where most men are told to slow down, to accept what they have, to be grateful for what is left. He could have cashed that Social Security check, found a quiet place to live out his remaining years, and nobody would have blamed him. Nobody would have called him a failure. But somewhere on that highway, with everything gone except a pressure cooker and a recipe nobody had asked for in years, Harland Sanders made a decision that most men his age never even consider making. What he could not have known in that moment was that losing the restaurant was not the end of his story. It was the only thing that could have ever led to the beginning of it. Everything he thought he had built, the building, the motel, the local reputation, none of that was ever the real asset. And in the years that followed, an entire nation would come to recognize his face, his name, and his recipe in a way that very few men in American history have ever been recognized. But that part of the story is still ahead of us. Right now, all that exists is a 62-year-old man, a highway, a $105 check, and a decision he is about to make that will change everything. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if stories like this move you, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next on The Silent Fortunes. His name was Harland Sanders. Not yet a colonel. Not yet a name that would one day appear on signs in nearly every town in America and in countries he had never even visited. In 1964, he was simply a 62-year-old man from Kentucky who had lost everything he had spent his life building, sitting with a Social Security check that would not even cover a month of modest living, let alone give him the means to start over. So how does a man at that age, with no business, no savings, and nothing but a car and a recipe, rebuild from absolutely nothing? What was it about that recipe, the one he had spent more than 30 years perfecting in the back of a roadside restaurant, that made him refuse to simply let it go, the way everything else had been taken from him? And what happened next? The moment that turned a man who had spent his life cooking chicken for travelers passing through a small Kentucky town into a name and a face recognized across the entire world. Those are the questions at the heart of this story. Because what Harland Sanders was holding onto in that car was not just a recipe. It was the one thing the highway, the bank, and time itself could not take from him. And what he was about to do with it would become one of the most remarkable second acts in American history. But in 1964, sitting on the side of that road, none of that had happened yet. All of it was still ahead of him, waiting on a decision he had not yet made. To understand what Harland Sanders lost on that highway in 1964, you have to understand everything he had already survived just to get there. He did not come from comfort. His father died when Harland was only 5 years old, leaving his mother to raise 3 children alone. By the time he was 7, Harland was cooking meals for his younger siblings while his mother worked. By 12, he had left school entirely, because in his world, survival came before education. From there, his life became a long list of jobs that most men would have called a series of dead ends. He worked as a farmhand. He became a streetcar conductor. He enlisted and served as a soldier. He worked as a fireman on the railroad, shoveling coal into steam engines for hours at a time. He sold insurance. By the time most men have settled into a career, Harland Sanders had already lived through half a dozen different lives, none of which had given him anything resembling stability. Then, In the 1930s, in the small town of Corbin, Kentucky, something finally began to take shape. Harland Sanders started running a service station, and he began cooking food for the travelers who stopped in for gas, using a small table in the corner of the station. His fried chicken, made with a recipe and a cooking method he had spent years refining, started drawing people in. Word spread. Travelers began stopping in Corbin specifically for his chicken. What started as a few tables grew into a full restaurant. He added a motel next door. By the late 1940s, Harland Sanders was not a rich man, but he was a successful one. He had built something real with his own hands, in his own town, and people across the region knew his name and knew his food. For a man who had spent his entire life moving from job to job with nothing to show for it, this was everything. This was proof that the years of struggle had finally led somewhere. And then, in the late 1950s, the federal government began building Interstate 75, a new highway designed to move traffic faster across the country. The new route bypassed Corbin, Kentucky entirely. The travelers who had once filled Harland Sanders' restaurant and motel simply stopped coming. Not because his food had changed, not because he had done anything wrong, but because the road itself had moved. Within a short period, his business collapsed. The restaurant and the motel that he had spent over a decade building were eventually sold at auction. By 1964, at 62 years old, Harland Sanders was left with almost nothing. No restaurant, no motel, no business, just a Social Security check for $105, a car, and the one thing that the highway, the auction, and time itself had not been able to take from him: the recipe, the pressure cooker, and the method he had spent over 30 years perfecting in that small Kentucky kitchen. At 62 years old, Harland Sanders' entire income was a Social Security check for $105 a month. Not $105 a week. A month. For a man who had spent his whole life working as a farmhand, a soldier, a railroad fireman, a restaurant owner, $105 a month was not retirement. It was barely survival. And so Harland Sanders did something that most men his age, in his position, would never have considered. He got in his car, with his pressure cooker and his recipe, and he started driving. From town to town, sleeping in the back seat of his car when he could not afford a room, eating whatever he could afford, wearing the same white suit day after day because it was the only suit he had that still looked respectable. If you had passed Harland Sanders on the road during this time, you would not have seen a future icon. You would have seen an old man in a wrinkled white suit, sleeping in his car at rest stops, carrying a pressure cooker from town to town like it was the only thing he owned that mattered. And in a way it was. Most people who knew him, or who heard about what he was doing, likely thought the same thing. That he was too old for this. That his time had already passed. That a man his age sleeping in his car was not the beginning of something. It was simply what happened to a man when everything else ran out. 62 was supposed to be the age you slowed down, not the age you started over with nothing. But there is a particular kind of pain that comes with being a man who has spent his entire life providing, for a business, for a town, for a family, and suddenly having nothing left to offer anyone. Harland Sanders had been the man people relied on. The man who ran the restaurant, who fed the travelers, who built something in his town that people were proud of. And now he was a 62-year-old man sleeping in a car, with a recipe that nobody had asked for in years, driving toward restaurants where he was, more often than not, simply turned away. Every closed door was not just a rejection of a business proposal. It was a quiet reminder of everything he had lost, and everything he was now unsure he could ever get back. And just when it seemed like there was no way out, something shifted. Here is where everything changed. Harland Sanders made a decision that, on the surface, sounds almost too simple to matter. He decided that even though he no longer had a restaurant, he still had something else, something that, until now, he had never thought to separate from the restaurant itself. He had the recipe. He had the method. He had 30 years of knowledge about exactly how to cook chicken in a way that made people drive for miles just to taste it. And so, instead of trying to rebuild a restaurant of his own, Harland Sanders decided to do something almost nobody was doing at the time. He decided to sell the recipe itself. His pitch was simple, and it was personal. He would drive to a restaurant, walk in wearing his white suit, and ask the owner for a chance to cook his chicken right there in their kitchen, for their staff, using his pressure cooker and his method. If they liked it, and almost everyone who tasted it did, he offered them a handshake deal. He would give them his recipe and his cooking method, and in exchange, they would pay him a few cents for every piece of chicken they sold using it. No large contracts, no corporate offices, just a recipe, a handshake, and a few cents per piece of chicken. This was the mindset shift that changed everything. Harland Sanders stopped thinking of himself as a man who needed to own a building in order to be in business. He started thinking of himself as something the world did not yet have a common word for: a franchisor. The restaurant in Corbin, the motel, the building itself, none of that had ever been the real asset. The real asset was the recipe, the system, and the reputation he could build one handshake at a time. But this shift in thinking did not mean instant success. Harland Sanders drove from restaurant to restaurant, and more often than not, he was turned away. Some owners were not interested. Some did not believe an old man in a white suit with a pressure cooker had anything worth their time. He heard no more times than most men could tolerate. But then, in Salt Lake City, Utah, a restaurant owner named Pete Harmon said yes. He tried the chicken, he saw what Harland Sanders was offering, and he agreed to the deal. It was a small agreement, between two men, based on nothing more than a taste test and a handshake. But it was the first yes. And once people in Salt Lake City started lining up for this chicken unlike anything they had tasted before, word began to spread to other restaurant owners, in other towns, in other states. The recipe that Harland Sanders had carried in the back seat of his car, the one thing nobody could take from him, was about to become the foundation of something far bigger than any restaurant he had ever owned. What followed was not an overnight success story. It was years. Years of Harland Sanders living almost exactly the way he had been living when this all began, driving from town to town, sleeping in his car, wearing the same white suit, walking into restaurant after restaurant with his pressure cooker and his recipe, cooking for owners one at a time, hoping for another yes. The difference now was that he had proof. He had Pete Harmon's restaurant in Salt Lake City, where people were lining up for this chicken. He could point to a result. But proof did not make the work easier. It still meant driving for hours, still meant cooking the same recipe over and over in unfamiliar kitchens, still meant convincing one owner at a time, one handshake at a time, while most men his age had stopped working years ago. As more restaurant owners said yes, Harland Sanders faced a new problem: making sure his chicken tasted exactly the same in Salt Lake City as it did in Kentucky, and the same in every new location after that. So he standardized everything. The same pressure cooker method, the same blend of 11 herbs and spices, mixed and measured precisely, so that no matter who was cooking it, the chicken would taste like his chicken. He trained restaurant staff himself, in their own kitchens, making sure they understood not just the recipe, but the method behind it. This was not just a man selling a taste. This was a man building a system that could be repeated, location after location, without him having to be there in person forever. Through the early 1960s, the number of restaurants using Harland Sanders' recipe and method grew, location by location, state by state. The name Kentucky Fried Chicken began appearing on signs across the country, and so did his image: the white suit, the string tie, the kind of face that people began to recognize the way they recognized very few business figures in America. By 1964, what had started with a $105 Social Security check and a single yes from Pete Harmon in Utah had become a nationwide brand with hundreds of locations. That year, at 73 years old, Harland Sanders sold the company for $2 million. But he did not disappear. He remained the face of the brand, traveling and representing the quality of the product he had spent his entire life perfecting for the rest of his life. What took years of relentless, unglamorous work, driving, cooking, convincing, one kitchen at a time, at an age when most men had already stopped working, became one of the most recognized brands in the history of American business. Today, Kentucky Fried Chicken is one of the most recognized brands on the entire planet, operating in countries Harland Sanders himself likely never visited. And his face, the white suit, the string tie, the kind smile, is still the face people see on every bucket, every sign, every storefront. Decades after his death, the image of a 62-year-old man who once sat broke on the side of a Kentucky highway is still one of the most recognized faces in the world. So what do we take from this? What are the silent fortunes hidden inside the life of Harland Sanders? The first silent fortune is this: what you have built can be taken from you, but what you know cannot. Harland Sanders lost his restaurant. He lost his motel. He lost the business he had spent over a decade building in Corbin, Kentucky, and he lost it through no fault of his own. A highway moved, and everything he had built around it became irrelevant overnight. But the highway could not take the recipe. It could not take the method. It could not take 30 years of knowledge about exactly how to cook chicken in a way that made people stop and remember it. If you are watching this and you have ever lost something you spent years building, a business, a job, a reputation, Harland Sanders is proof that what you carry in your mind and in your hands is the one thing that can never be auctioned off. The second silent fortune is this. Rejection is not a verdict. It is simply the cost of finding the one yes that matters. Harland Sanders drove to restaurant after restaurant and heard no more times than most men could tolerate. Every closed door could have been the moment he stopped. But he kept driving, kept cooking, kept offering the same handshake deal, until one man in Salt Lake City said yes. That single yes, after dozens of no's, became the foundation for everything that followed. If you are watching this and you have faced rejection after rejection on something you believe in, Harland Sanders' story is proof that the no's are not the end of the story. They are simply the price of admission for the one yes that changes everything. And the third silent fortune, the one most people never talk about, is this. 62 is not the end of the story. For Harland Sanders, it was the first chapter of the only part of the story anyone remembers. He spent decades working job after job, building and losing a business, and by the time most men are winding down, he was just getting started on the thing that would define his entire legacy. If you are 40 years old watching this, or 50, or 62, Harland Sanders is proof that the door is not closed. It may not even be open yet, but it is not closed. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer in the comments below. At what point in Harland Sanders' story do you think everything truly changed? Was it the moment he lost the restaurant, the motel, everything he had spent his life building, when the highway moved and took it all with it? Or was it the moment afterward, sitting with a $105 check, with nothing left, when he decided to get in his car anyway and start again? Think about that, because the answer might tell you something about your own life, right now, today. If Harland Sanders' story gave you something, a lesson, a perspective, a reason to look at your own situation a little differently, then you already know what to do next. Subscribe to The Silent Fortunes, because every single week, we come back here and uncover another story the world forgot to tell. If Harland Sanders' story moved you, wait until you hear about a man who hit rock bottom not alone, but with his son by his side. A man who spent a night with nothing left in the world except a toddler asleep in his arms, and a promise he had no idea if he could keep. There is a part of that story that has never been fully told. What that night really cost him as a father. That story is coming next on The Silent Fortunes.